All right, well, Daniel chapter 3 is all about the fiery furnace story. So this is again another chapter where we've heard the story. Maybe some of the details we're a little fuzzy on, but we're going to get into that to understand a little bit more about this today. So begin off with verse 1, excuse me. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits. That's 90 feet tall. That is a tall image of gold. And the breadth thereof 6 cubits, basically. So this is a 10-to-1 ratio, basically. It's really, really tall, basically. He'll set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. So this is in the plain out near the city Babylonia, basically in province areas where he's got this idol, this big statue, basically. Verse 2, the Nebuchadnezzar, the king, sent to gather together the princes, the governors, and the captains, judges, treasurers, counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. So this is the rulers, basically. All the different levels of leadership in the government for Babylon were coming together for this. Verse 3, then the princes, the governors, the captains, judges, treasurers, counselors, and sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces were gathered together unto the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Okay, so they're here now. He's called these people together, rulers, the administrators, not the common people, just these rulers, administrators, the governmental people, basically. Why do you think he did this? That's coming here in just a couple of verses. So it's interesting to think about this idea of gathering together. It's as if the world wants to have leaders control every aspect of your life, and so you live in a worldly way, is kind of a thought to think about. At least that's what I think about when I think about this story. Now going on, verse 4, then an herald cried aloud, to you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at the time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king hath set up. So when you hear the music, you fall down and you worship this big golden statue that's out here. Verse 6, and whoso falleth not down and worshipeth shall the same hour be cast in the midst of a burning fiery furnace. So you have your choice to make. You can die or worship. It's not really much of a choice if you think about it, but that's their choices. So, of course, everybody's like, well, I don't want to die, so I guess I'm going to worship this idol, basically, this ginormous idol that the king has set up, basically. So verse 7, if you think about verse 6 for just a second here, this is testing loyalty. He tested the loyalty and the wisdom of his priests before in the last chapter. Now in this chapter he's testing the loyalty to the king. Basically, are you going to do what the king says, or are you going to defy the king? This is something that's important to think about from that thought of the world wants to control you. The world wants you to follow it. Okay, the world wants your loyalty, and if you don't give it, they punish you. The world wants you to put you in a divide where you have to choose between what everyone else is doing and what you know to be true. So he's using popular opinion to keep people in line. Anyone can turn anybody in this as well. So this is, again, testing that loyalty, challenging the people. Now if you think about this idea of where this would be present-day Europa. Dura Europos, it basically is where you'd see this. Now let's see, verse 7, therefore, at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the instruments, all kinds of music, all the people, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar, the king, had set up. Now here's what's interesting is this is similar to the stories in Abraham's time of the yearly celebrations. There's a year-right celebration that would happen in the ancient world as well, where once a year the king was revered as kind of like a god and worshipped, basically. And they would sacrifice to the god once a year, kind of like that idea of sacrificing the three virgins to the god, kind of an idea. This is a similar one, basically. So Nebuchadnezzar setting up basically a nationwide religion. Now you're going to worship my idol, and I've built it, and you're going to worship it. And if you don't worship it, you're going to burn to death in the furnace, basically. So you need to follow. You kind of don't. You technically have a choice, but you don't really have much of a choice, honestly, in this. And that's very common for like worldly ideas and worldly philosophies and things. They don't want to really give you. They want to make you think you have a choice, but they really don't want you to have choice. They want you to go in a certain direction. So they kind of manipulate it that way. Verse 8, wherefore at that time certain Chaldeans came near and accused the Jews. We're going to see this. Now they spake and said to the king Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. Thou, O king, hast made a decree that every man that shall hear the sound of the instruments and all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth, that he should be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And so they're going, now you said this, right, king? And king's like, yep, I said it. Verse 11, and now verse 12, they're going, well, there are certain Jews whom thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. There's a good chance that these are people, they're basically turning in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're turning them in. They're telling on them. And most likely these are probably the people who used to be in leadership but then got demoted because Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego got over them. I think that's a possibility. These aren't just average persons going, hey, why aren't my leaders doing this? These are probably people that don't like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or don't like the fact that a Jew is higher in authority in Babylon than they are. So there could be some people using this as an opportunity to get the Jews out of the way. Could be here, basically. Now, what's interesting is they didn't mention Daniel in this. That's interesting. They didn't mention Daniel in that verse 12. But they're specifying Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego out, basically. So let's see. Verse 13, then Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage and fury, commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spake and said unto them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, do not ye serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? Now if ye be ready, that at what time ye hear the sound of the instruments and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the image which I have made. Well, but if ye worship not, ye shall be cast the same hour into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? So basically he's saying here, he's giving them a chance. Hey, look, guys, if this is true, will you just worship my God? When you hear the sounds, kneel down, lay down and worship my God, basically. It's fascinating because when Nebuchadnezzar set this decree up at the beginning of the chapter, there was no second chance. It was pretty black and white. But now he's going, okay, guys, if this is true, then please just follow the law. Follow the law and you'll be okay. Can you follow the law? Basically. So he doesn't want to get rid of them. And probably because they're friends of Daniel, and Daniel's pretty powerful in the kingdom. And it's interesting, though, that Daniel's probably very favored of the king, which is why they didn't mention Daniel. They got Daniel's friends out of the way. It's just interesting how this is all working out. You can kind of think of some of these dynamics that are going on with this. Now, in verse 16, he says, Now Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. Or basically, other translations of this, we don't have to answer to you, is what they meant in verse 16. So verse 17, if it be so, or if it is God's will, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand O king. So basically, if it's God's will, then he'll deliver us. If it's not his will, we're okay to die because we are keeping the commandments. We're we're good with our conscience in going back to God. Basically, if you're going to kill us because of a stupid arbitrary rule you put in place, that's on your head, man. You're going to have to answer that. We're still keeping our commandments with God, basically. So that's kind of what they're saying. So while God is omnipotent and can help us, sometimes his omniscience or wisdom of what is best is better. Now, this is important to think about, okay? That's this concept. So they're basically saying, look, we know our God has the power to save us from this, but we also know that he might see it better in our interest to not save us from this. So think about this when you think about, why does God allow wicked things to happen, or why does God allow people to be punished, or bad things to happen to people and stuff? His plan isn't about stopping bad stuff. His plan is about exercising agency and then dealing with those consequences of that agency. And so sometimes his wisdom is more important than his power. So we need to realize that when bad things happen in our lives or challenges happen sometimes his wisdom of what this is going to do is better than, oh, God, save me from everything. God's not a helicopter parent. He's not a wheelbarrow parent. He wants you to learn and grow and improve, and sometimes that means letting you make bad choices. And sometimes those bad choices can hurt other people, but you have to deal with those. That's your agency. That's where the atonement makes up the difference and helps compensate for those things, basically. So Jared Halverson made some comments about this. In fact, he says, this is really what life is about, proving the contrary between these two, between if it be so and but if not, thy will be done. So he actually, Jared, when he was talking about this in one of his I think it's a part of his podcast, when he's talking about this part of Daniel, in fact, this idea of if it be so, but if not, is kind of a phrase we'll see sometimes in scriptures, and it sets us up of, well, I hope it goes this way, but if not, I'm okay if it goes this way, because that's the wisdom of God. Examples, the three daughters of Anitas, they got, but if not, while these three boys in Daniel got, if it be so. Samuel the Lamanite in the Book of Mormon got, if it be so, when the arrows couldn't hit him, whereas Abinadi got, but if not, and was burned at the stake. Jesus asked for, if it be so, and willingly received, but if not, for us all. So that's where that idea came in. Remember, Christ asked, if there's another way we can do this, let's do it. But if not, I will suffer and go through this. That's basically the same concept, the same idea. And this is, again, life is about Abraham 3:25. Are you going to do what God asks of you or not? If God asks you to die for him, are you going to die for him? If God asks you to live righteously for him, are you going to live righteously for him? That's this dynamic, basically. Now, verse 18, they continue on and says, but if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. So again, that's that idea of our God has the power to save us, but if he doesn't save us, doesn't mean he doesn't have power. It means his wisdom of what's going on is more important. So they're kind of turning it back on Nebuchadnezzar now. So verse 19, then was Nebuchadnezzar full of fury, and the form of his visage, or the expression of his countenance, how he looked, was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So before he was willing to give him a second chance, now they're defying him, and so he's pissed. His ego is kicked in. He's mad now. Therefore he spake and commanded that they should heat the furnace 7 times more than it was wont to be heated. 7 times greater than before. Now this is interesting. Keil and Delitzsch in their commentary in the Old Testament said, if the three were brought up to the furnace, it must have had a mouth above through which the victims could be cast into it. Let's see where I just missed it here. When heated to an ordinary degree, this could be done without danger to the men who performed the service. But in the present case, the heat of the fire was so great that the servants themselves perished by it. So the idea of heating the furnace 7 times hotter, it might not be 100% true that it was literally 7 times hotter, but it could be an idiomatic representation of the idea that they were to make it much, much hotter than normal. So this is a furnace that is really being pushed to the hilt, basically. So verse 20, and he commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their hosen, and their hats, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fire furnace. So they put clothes on them. They had all their clothes, the royal clothes and things were on them. So they had clothes to catch fire and to burn, and then they were tossed in. Now, verse 22, therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent, and the furnace exceeding hot, the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So this was so hot that the 3 guys, by the time they got up there and pushed them in, these guys were being burned, and these guys were dying from it. Verse 23, and these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. So there's got to be a way that they went up and got tossed into it from above. They weren't pushed in from the side probably, but dropped in from above. Verse 24, then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished, and rose up in haste, and spake, and said unto his counselors, did not we cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? And they answered and said to the king, true, O king. And he answered and said, lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt. And the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Now this is interesting. He's going, wait, there's 4. We tossed 3 in, right? And they were bound up? Yeah. There's 4 of them, and they're all walking around. They're loose. So here's something that's interesting, okay? Dan McClellan said this in one of his podcasts. He said, the Hebrew Bible translated this verse as a son of the gods or an angelic being. Not necessarily. This is not a specific reference to Jesus. Okay, in the King James Version, it says, the form is the 4th like the Son of God. So what do we think of when we think of the Son of God? We think of Jesus Christ. And what Dan McClellan is saying, it might not be Jesus that was in there. Because the Hebrew version, which is the more original version, is the verse is a son of the gods or an angelic being. That's just as possible with the translation. So it doesn't necessarily have to be Jesus Christ himself, but an angelic visitor as well. Now, one thing that you could say is, if this is Christ, I think this would be a nice metaphor to say that Christ is always with us in our trials. He is always there to help us. We might not see him like they could see him, but he is there in our trials, basically. So always remember that God is there in your bad times. So there's just a little bit of a distinction on that we want to be careful with. Verse 26, then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace, and spake and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ye servants of the Most High God, come forth and come hither. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth of the midst of the fire. So the fire's probably died down, and they're still alive. And he's like, okay, come on out. Verse 27, and the princes, governors, captains, and the king's counselors, being gathered together, saw these men, upon whose bodies the fire had no power, nor was an hair of their head singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire had passed on them. Man, wouldn't that be nice to be around a fire and not have the smell on you? This is pretty good. They, like, literally, not even the smells got them. They don't even smell like fire. Verse 28, then Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who hath sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him, and have changed the king's word, and yielded their bodies that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. So this is a change for Nebuchadnezzar to realize this. Okay, they defied God, or they defied Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar threw him in there, and God defied Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar's going, oh, okay, so I'm not as powerful as I thought. Verse 29, therefore I make a decree that every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. Now, think about this. He said in that decree, he didn't change his decree. to worship the idol. He just said, if you try to say something bad against their God, you will be destroyed. He didn't change his decree. We don't see that in here. He kept his philosophy. I'm not changing my opinion, but I cannot dispute what you just did, basically. Verse 30, then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So that definitely, if the people that accused them, that turned them in, were trying to get them out of the way, that backfired, because now Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are more powerful, have more clout in the kingdom. So pretty interesting how that story has turned out. Now, of course, this is not the end of the amazing miracles that we see in the book of Daniel. There's more in the next chapter as we continue forward, so we'll see you over there.